So when we left off in the 16th century BCE or the 1500s BCE, Jacob, or Israel, either name would work, moved with his 12 sons to Egypt because there was famine in Canaan. In the 15th century, their descendants had become so numerous that the Pharaoh freaked out and enslaved all of these Israelites, or sometimes you'll hear them referred to as Hebrews. And in the 13th century BCE, the Pharaoh had put out an order saying that all Hebrew baby boys should be thrown into the Nile, should be killed. One Levite woman hid her son in a basket on the side of the river. The Pharaoh's daughter found this basket, found this child, and named it Moses. Now the Bible says that Moses, the name Moses, means drawn out of water. But it seems much more likely that the name actually is an Egyptian name. It means born of, or son of. So Tutmos means son of Toth, or Tuth. Ramses means son of Ra. Either way, Moses was raised in the royal palace. Notice again how similar this is to the Sargon story. He grew up free. But when he was 40, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, or an Israelite slave, and he killed the Egyptian. Once he thought that the law was going to catch up with him for this, he ran away. He ran away to the land of Midian, just on the other side of the Gulf of Aqaba in northwest Arabia. This is actually going to be a pretty important location, not in this story, but when we look at the roots of Yahweh worship later on, it seems that Yahweh worship might have actually started in this very area. Just remember this. While he was in Midian, he helped protect some local priests against shepherds, and he married one of their daughters, Zipporah. After a few decades of living in Midian, the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, died, and so he figured it was safe to go back home again. And as he's thinking about this, God was again, or Yahweh was again moved to fulfill his promise to Abraham. Remember that Abraham's descendants would be multitudes of great nations, but so far they're enslaved. It doesn't seem like the promise or the covenant is being fulfilled. Yahweh is now being moved to start fulfilling that covenant. So by the time we get to the late 13th century, the end of the 1200s BCE, maybe around that time of the Merneptah Stele, 1207 BCE, Moses was out tending his father-in-law's sheep. Incidentally, his father-in-law's name was Jethro, if you've ever wondered where that name came from. And while he was out tending his father-in-law's sheep, God appears to him in a burning bush. Though this is a bush that's on fire, but it doesn't burn up. And in this burning bush, God speaks to Moses and tells him to go free the Hebrew people. He says that after freeing them, he will bring them up to the promised land, a land said to be flowing with milk and honey. In other words, a land with abundant food. Moses, of course, is concerned, how are they even going to know who I've been gone for a long time? Why would they even follow me? I grew up in the Pharaoh's household. And so God gives him kind of some magic tricks to show how powerful Moses is, that he can use this with the Hebrew leaders to convince them that he's been sent by God. So, for example, God has him throw his staff on the ground. When he throws it down, it turns into a snake. When he picks up the snake by his tail, it gets turned back into a staff again. He has us put his hand in his cloak, and when he takes it out, it's all sickly and worn down and everything. And then he puts his hand back in his cloak and it comes out, and it's good again. When he gets into Egypt, Moses even is told to take water out of the Nile and pour it on the ground, and when he pours on the ground, it turns into blood. All of these are seen as signs that he was endowed with special powers by God, or chosen by God. Now, one of Moses' problems was that he was uncomfortable speaking in public. It's been theorized maybe he had a stutter or something like that, so he went to his older brother, a man named Aaron, to essentially be his speaker for him, to do his talking for him. So with the Hebrews united behind him, ready to go, Moses and Aaron go to the Pharaoh's court to say, it's time to let my people go. And of course the Pharaoh is like, why would I do that? And they essentially kind of end up in a magic off, between each other. So Aaron does what Moses had done beforehand. He throws his staff on the ground, it turns into a snake. The Egyptian priests then do the same thing. They throw their staffs onto the ground, and those turn into snakes. One of the things to remember is that the early Israelites weren't monotheists. They didn't think that God was the only God. They just thought that God was their God and the most powerful God. So they're not denying that the Egyptians had magical power as well. But to really drive home that their God was better, Aaron's snake eats all of their snakes. Then he picks it back up and it's a staff again. Remember, the early books of the Old Testament or of the Hebrew Bible do not claim that other gods don't have power. Later on, we're going to get to that. We're not there yet. Even with Aaron winning this magic off with Moses there, the Pharaoh isn't convinced. So it's decided that God is going to send 10 plagues onto Egypt. For the first one, Moses turns the Nile to blood. He casts out his hand over the Nile, it turns to blood, all the fish in the river die. There's no water to go around. They actually had to dig out wells in order to get fresh water for a week. The Nile was just blood. And according to the Bible, the Egyptian priests were able to pull off the same trick. After that, Moses calls frogs out of the Nile, and they cover all of Egypt. This is really annoying, but after a few days, those frogs die and their corpses stink up the land. Again, according to the Bible, the Egyptian priests were able to pull off the same trick. So then Moses calls up gnats, mosquitoes or lice, something like that. He calls them up out of the dust of the earth. This is actually a trick that the Egyptian priests aren't able to pull off. And you can imagine being covered in biting bugs like mosquitoes or lice. Pretty awful. After that, Moses calls out swarms of flies to cover all of Egypt, though it's noted that they don't end up in the land of Goshen, where the Hebrews are mostly living. When that doesn't convince Pharaoh, a pestilence or a sickness comes out and kills all the livestock of Egypt, except for the livestock that the Hebrews owned. Then for the sixth plague, Moses picks up some soot out of the fireplace. He throws it up in the air, and it spreads all over Egypt, and everybody ends up getting covered in boils. Horrifically painful. Matter of fact, the Egyptian priests, they can't even try to pull off this trick because they're in so much pain from being covered in boils. When that didn't work, Moses calls out thunder and hail that kills all the slaves and all the livestock that are in the fields. And incidentally, Moses had given an actual warning on this, but the Egyptians, who feared God or appropriately feared God, they got inside, they lived. The Egyptians that had hubris and they weren't scared of Yahweh, they paid the price. When that didn't work, locusts were brought out, and they ate the remaining grain crops and all of the fruit crops. Still, Pharaoh is not letting the Hebrew people go. So for the ninth plague, the land is covered in darkness for 3 days. Finally, Pharaoh says, I'll let you guys go, but you can't take your livestock with you. We got to keep it. We've just lost most of our livestock. And essentially, Moses tells them to shove it. They're taking everything, all of their stuff. And so God decides that he will kill the firstborn of all Egyptians, both livestock and humans. Now God has Moses and Aaron prepare the Israelites, prepare the Hebrews for this final plague. What they were required to do, each family was supposed to slaughter a lamb for their dinner and then paint their door frames with its blood. This 10th plague, God himself passed through Egypt and killed every firstborn human and animal. However, he passed over the houses with blood on their door frame. This is the first Passover, Judaism's most important holiday. And it's also a reminder, I think, for a lot of Christians who view God as just this loving, all taking care of God. This is also a God that's willing to kill children in order to carry out his plan. This is not to say this is an evil God. It's just to say that this is a more complex God than I think in the modern day we often think of Yahweh as. With this, Pharaoh finally lets the Hebrews go. God himself comes to the Hebrews, and he appears as a pillar of clouds by day and a pillar of fire by night, and he essentially starts leading them out of Egypt. But God decided they needed to toughen up a little bit before they were going to go and invade Canaan. He saw that they were going to have to go to war with the Philistines and the Canaanites, people that were in that land. So he had them wander around the Sea of Reeds for a while. You might have heard of Moses parting the Red Sea. He doesn't part the Red Sea, he parts the Sea of Reeds, which is probably some type of a marshland near the Gulf of Suez. And as they're wandering around, they're not getting out of Egypt. God's kind of moving them around in circles, and the Pharaoh's like, I thought I was going to let you guys go. Why have you not left yet? And they're just following this pillar of fire / pillar of clouds around the Sea of Reeds, and God changes Pharaoh's heart. Remember, he's trying to toughen up these Israelites, and he decides that he's going to make the Pharaoh attack the Israelites. So the Pharaoh chases the Israelites all the way up to the Sea of Reeds. It seems like there's no way out. And again, Moses does a little bit of a magic trick. He waves his hand over the water, and the sea parts. The waters part. The Israelites run out over the dry land. They're escaping out of Egypt, and just as they get to the other side, the Pharaoh and his army come into this dry land as well. Once the Hebrews are out of trouble's way, Moses again waves his hand over the water, and the waters come back. They kill the Pharaoh. They drown all of Pharaoh's army. For now, the Hebrews are in the wilderness. They've now started making their way into the Sinai Desert. They're not quite there yet. They're on the edges of it. But within 3 months, they reach the Sinai Peninsula. And as they're wandering around, again being led by God, God does provide them with food. There's no real food out in the desert, but he provides manna or bread falling from heaven. When they had nothing to drink, he gave them fresh water by having Moses strike a rock with his staff, and water comes pouring out of the rock. And he eventually leads them to a mountain. In Exodus, this mountain is called Mount Sinai. In a later book, Deuteronomy, it's called Mount Horeb. We'll call it Mount Sinai. We're still in the book of Exodus right now, so we'll go with what Exodus is calling it. He leads them to Mount Sinai. And at Mount Sinai, God settled on it in the form of cloud and fire and loud thunder. This sounds a whole lot like a volcano, but there are no volcanoes in the Sinai Peninsula. Doesn't mean the Israelites were unfamiliar with volcanoes, and this would make great imagery. After settling down on that, God spoke what is now referred to as the 10 Commandments to the Israelites. Number 1, have no other gods except for Yahweh. You'll notice he isn't saying there aren't any other gods. He's saying that they should have no other gods except for him. He needs to be their exclusive God. Number 2, make no idols. This is a world where all gods are represented in idols. Yahweh is saying, like, you can't depict me. There's no real way for you to be able to depict this awesomeness of me. You shouldn't be trying to take things that are heaven and make them earthly. Number 3, don't make wrongful use of God's name. You might have heard this, don't take the Lord's name in vain. Number 4, keep the Sabbath holy as a day of rest. In the creation story, or in one of the creation stories, God creates the world over the course of 6 days. On the 7th day, he rests. That is the Sabbath. Now, the Sabbath for Christians is on Sunday, but for Jews, for Israelites, it was on Saturday. So no work on Saturday, just as God did. Number 5, honor your mother and father. Number 6, do not murder. Number 7, don't commit adultery. Number 8, don't steal. Number 9, don't bear false witness against one's neighbor. Don't lie about people. And finally, number 10, don't covet your neighbor's house or wife or land or livestock or any other property. Now, after God speaks these 10 commandments, it totally freaks out the Hebrews. They're overwhelmed by this God that's speaking directly to them. And so they sent Moses up to the base of the mountain in order to get the rest of the law. Let him deal with Yahweh. And when Moses went up to the base of the mountain, God gave him a whole lot of additional laws, like don't make altars by chiseling stones. Just stack stones up. Don't shape them out. And one of my favorites is don't make stairs going up to the altars, because if you go up to the altar and people are below you and you bend over to do stuff on the altar back in the day when people only wore like tunics, people are going to see your goodies. These laws also included rules on how to take slaves, how to treat them. It included a list of capital offenses, things that you could do that could get you the death penalty, which included cursing your parents. There were property laws and rules for restitution after theft. and a whole lot of other stuff. In total, there were over 600 laws, and Moses wrote them all down for the Israelites. This is where we get the idea of Mosaic law. Mosaic law, Israelite law, the law of the Old Testament. This is it. And it sounds a whole lot like Hammurabi's law or Ur-Nammu's law, where Moses got it from the God, and it's a whole list of this is how you deal with criminals or criminal behavior. After this, God called on Moses to come up the mountain with his helper, a man named Joshua, to retrieve 2 tablets that God actually wrote the laws on. So Moses and Joshua go up to the top of the mountain into the cloud where God is at. They hang out there for 40 days and 40 nights, the same length as Noah's flood, or at least the storm of Noah's flood. 40 pops up again and again and again. It's, you might remember that Moses was 40 when he killed an Egyptian. He was 80 when he went back into Egypt. And while they were up there, God described how to properly worship him. God said that they need to make an ark for carrying sacred objects. This is what we call the Ark of the Covenant. It's a golden chest that's topped with 2 cherubim. Cherubim are very similar to sphinxes. God said they needed to make a tabernacle or a special tent for him to reside in. It would be where he would receive offerings like gold and fine cloth and livestock. This tabernacle meant that the Hebrews would have God's presence with them wherever they went. Eventually, it's going to be transferred to the temple in Jerusalem, but we're not there yet. Within that tabernacle, they needed to set up a curtain that separated the holy place from the most holy place. This Holy of Holies is where the Ark of the Covenant would be placed. And to be clear, holy just means separate, like separate from the regular world. God said that they needed to create special clothing for priests. He said that Aaron and his descendants would be the ones that actually take care of the tabernacle. This is the beginning of what we call the Aaronite priesthood. These are the people who are going to become the high priests within the temple after it's made. So it's not Moses' descendants that are going to become the high priests. It's his brothers, Aaron's descendants. And again, in the modern day, all of these laws, all of these ways of worshiping, along with a bit more in the Torah, are what we call Mosaic law. Jesus himself later on, when we get to the New Testament, Jesus refers to the Torah, this section, as the law. When he says the law and the prophets, he's referring to the Old Testament or to the Hebrew Bible, to the Tanakh as a whole. Now, there was a problem. While Moses and Joshua were gone, the Hebrews were getting impatient, and Moses' brother Aaron decided to make a gold calf to worship. Moses comes down the mountain. He sees the Hebrews worshiping this gold calf. He gets angry, and he breaks the 2 tablets that God himself had inscribed. There is clearly a struggle happening here, because as I said before in the first video, a lot of the Hebrew or Israelite altars that we have in the modern day in those high places, they have depictions of bulls. Cows are a huge part of Canaanite culture. And this is one of those things that seems to be a later story that's trying to push back against this. Get rid of your Canaanite origins. Stop worshiping cattle. Stop worshiping calves in this case. Moses not only breaks the original tablets that God himself had inscribed, he takes the golden calf that was created, he pulverizes it, he puts it in water, and he makes the Israelites drink it. Then he gathers up the rest of the Levites, not Aaron, but the rest of the descendants of Levi. And he had them go out and kill 3,000 fellow Hebrews. Their job, from here on out, is to keep the Hebrews or keep the Israelites holy. And in this case, if the Israelites are not doing holy things, if they're not doing God's things, if they're not staying separate from the rest of the world, they kill 3,000 of them at random. Moses then goes back up the mountain. He asks God to forgive the Hebrews. God then sends a plague to kill a few more of them to really drive the point home. God has Moses come out and hang on the mountain for another 40 days and 40 nights. And God has Moses this time write out the 10 Commandments on new tablets. Though these 10 Commandments are different. They are not the 10 Commandments that you usually hear about. They're not the 10 Commandments that I just listed out. These 10 Commandments are often referred to as the ritual Decalogue. The 10 Commandments I listed out beforehand are often just called the Decalogue or the 10 Laws. But the ritual Decalogue is a little different. This one still had, you don't murder, you don't lie, you don't do property crimes. It still said not to worship other gods and to make idols. But this included the commandment of requiring certain holy days or holidays, like the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It required to not mix animal sacrifice with anything containing yeast. It also required to not boil young goats in their mother's milk. After Moses brings everything back down, they made all this stuff that was required for proper worship. They made the ark, they made the tabernacle, they made priestly clothing. And with this finally being settled, with knowing what God's law are while they're still in the wilderness, the book of Exodus ends. Exodus is followed by the book of Leviticus, which gave rules for the priesthood, especially for Aaronites. It describes again in a more detail the correct way to sacrifice. It described how to maintain ritual purity and how to resist disease. So, for example, when women are menstruating, they're supposed to go away. They're not supposed to be around anybody else when they're on their period. If they sit on anything, that thing is automatically considered to be impure and has to be destroyed. And when women are on their period, they can't be touched. This is part of the law that comes out of the book of Leviticus. The next book, the fourth book in the Torah, in the initial law of the Bible, the next book is the book of Numbers. And Numbers actually opens up with taking a census of which men can fight. That word Numbers, the name, the title Numbers, just refers to the two censuses that are taken, the two head counts that are taken during this book. The Levites, for their part, are excluded from fighting others. Their job, again, is to keep the Israelites holy. Well, after a year in Sinai, God started leading the Hebrews out towards the land of Canaan. And once they got close, 12 spies were sent out to scout out the land of Canaan. This includes that guy Joshua that we had just talked about, that special helper of Moses. When they returned, 2, including Joshua, said, "Oh, it's just like God promised. It's a land flowing with milk and honey." The other 10 said it was a land of giants. The average Israelite said, "Oh, there's no way. It's a land of giants. They're going to massacre us if we actually invade." This really freaked out the rest of the Hebrews, and they refused to invade the land as God was commanding them to do so. They didn't actually believe that Yahweh would help them. Such a weird story. These are people who have heard Yahweh's voice, but they're just like, I don't know if he has our back. Because of this, God, Yahweh, decided that this generation of men didn't deserve to go into the promised land. He killed the 10 spies who gave the reports of giants with plague, and then he made the Israelites wander the wilderness, wander the desert, for 40 years. I really love that number, 40. They skirted around Canaan, coming up on the east side of the Jordan River. And during this time, there were skirmishes with Canaanite kings and the surrounding tribes, but God did not allow the Hebrews to invade. He was waiting for the men who were too scared to do it to die off. Now, near the end of this wandering, Israelites took land on the east of the Jordan River. This is actually going to become the homeland of 2 of Israel's tribes, Reuben and Gad. So it's kind of an invasion, but we're not really into the promised land. This, of course, is meant to set them up for the invasion. They're going to cross the Jordan River. They're going to take the land of Canaan. And before all this happens, God gives instructions to Moses that the Hebrews are going to have to drive out all the inhabitants, destroy all of their idols and all of their altars. A year before the invasion started, Aaron died. His son Eleazar became high priest. This is where the book of Numbers ends and the book of Deuteronomy begins. That word Deuteronomy literally means second law, and it's clearly written by a later author than a lot of the stuff that we're getting in the first 4 books of the Torah. A lot of the Deuteronomy is kind of a recap of their journey through the wilderness, includes a recap of Mosaic law. And near the end of this book, God gets really tired of Moses asking to enter Canaan. Of course, Moses is like, I did what you wanted me to. I led them. I want to see the promised land. I want to get there. And so God has Moses go up on a mountain to look over the Jordan River. If you ever heard the phrase, I've looked over Jordan, this is what it's referring to. And he tells him to look over the Jordan River to see the promised land. Moses takes a look at the land of Canaan that's been promised to the Hebrews. And then God says, I'm never letting you in. You don't get to go there. Your people are going to get there, but you're not going to get there. and tells Moses that he needs to prepare Joshua to lead the invasion. Just before the invasion starts, Moses dies. This is the end of the Torah. The Torah, the collection of laws or the teachings, ends with this right here. And it should be noted that tradition says that Moses wrote all 5 books of the Torah. Of course, there's a little bit of a problem because it includes the death of Moses, and as we'll talk about later on, it's clear that it's written by multiple authors. It also needs to be noted that later on you're going to hear the term Pentateuch, or the Pentateuch is the Greek translation of the Torah, of the 5 books, the 5 books of the Torah. Just be aware that these are the same name for pretty much the same thing, but of course, in any translation, things do get changed. But as we know, this isn't the end of the story. This is the end of the Torah. This is now going to be our transition into the Nevi'im, into the book of prophets. The next 4 books are the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings. And it should be noted that later Christians actually break up Samuel into 1st and 2nd Samuel and Kings into 1st and 2nd Kings. But that's not how it is in the Hebrew Bible. And by the time we get to the second half of the book of Kings, we actually are going to see history, like corroborated history, archaeology, what's being written down in other places, start to line up with this history. But we're still in the mythical lands of people telling stories of hundreds of years beforehand, and a lot of this is based on folk tales, including the stuff that's coming up next. So the first book of prophets is the book of Joshua. And as you would imagine, it's about Joshua's invasion. First, he sends in scouts. At this point, we're in the early 12th century BCE, in the early 1100s, 1190s, 1180s. Sometime around then, God dried up the Jordan River. Joshua led the 12 tribes across that dry riverbed. Now, the very first city they attacked was Jericho. Jericho, by the way, might be the oldest walled city, probably is the oldest walled city in the world. And so at this point, we're well past the Bronze Age when it's being written down. It is a city that has been known for its walls for a couple thousand years. But according to Genesis, they attacked Jericho. God had Hebrew troops march around the city once per day for 6 days, while 7 priests blew ram's horns, and other priests carried the Ark of the Covenant in front of this whole parade. On the 7th day, they marched around it 7 times, and the walls fell down. Ever heard about walls crumbling down, or the walls of Jericho? This is the incident it's related to. We don't have any archaeological evidence for this, but it's a pretty good story. Over the next few years, Israelites conquered all of Canaan, with one exception, Philistia, this area over here where the Philistines lived. One of the things that we know is the Philistines themselves actually were the remnants of sea peoples. They are not Canaanites, even though they're interacting with the Canaanite culture. They may actually be related to the Greek people. In some cases, it was commanded that they massacre entire populations. So, for example, the city of Hazor was said to be the main city of northern Canaan, according to Joshua 11:11. They put to sword all who were in it, utterly destroying them. There was no one left who breathed, and he burned Hazor with fire. This, if you've ever heard of God commanding genocide, this is one of the incidents. The conquest of Canaan, according to the Tanakh, to the Hebrew Bible, is an absolute massacre and at times genocidal. Again, we don't have any archaeological evidence for this. This probably didn't happen, but this is the story. After this conquest, Joshua divided up the land between the tribes. The Levites themselves were not given any large land, but they were given 48 cities. And 6 of these cities were set aside as places of refuge for people escaping the violence of blood feud. That is, if they accidentally killed somebody and they were worried about that family getting revenge on them, they could run away to one of these sanctuary cities that the Levites ran. The tribe of Joseph was actually split into 2, Ephraim and Manasseh. So really there's kind of 13 tribes. It's not super consistent, but there's definitely a push to try to say that there are 12 tribes of Israel. You might remember the number 12 was huge in the ancient world. We're talking about 12 months in a year, 12 astrological signs according to the Babylonians. A number system that's based on 6s and 12s. The book of Joshua ends after this conquest with the death of Joshua and the high priest Eleazar. which then leads us to the book of Judges. This book opens up with problems of leftover Canaanites. In other words, not all the Canaanites were killed. There are still Canaanites in this land, and of course, there are still Philistines in this land. A lot of the action in the book is about dealing with Canaanites, Philistines, and other local enemies. And it needs to be noted, this period of Judges, which is somewhere in the mid-12th century through the 11th century BCE, through the 1000s BCE, is a time where the Israelites aren't actually united. They're each living in their own tribes. They each have their own traditions and ways of ruling each other. Sometimes they will team up underneath a judge, underneath a great figure in order to fight against their enemies, but they are not unified. Some common patterns that pop up in this: Israelite tribes are influenced by rival religions. They end up worshiping idols. And in punishment for this, God lets their enemies harass them, conquer them, oppress them. They then repent. They bring their worship back to Yahweh. And God sends a war leader, somebody called a judge, to bring back their power. Some of these judges actually gave legal rulings, but most of them were just war chieftains. A couple of the most famous judges. One was Deborah. Deborah is the only woman judge, and she was also a prophet. To be clear, prophet doesn't necessarily mean predicting the future. Prophets can predict the future. It just means somebody who speaks for God. So Adam and Noah and Abraham are all seen as prophets within the Jewish tradition. Deborah starts off as what we would think of as a regular judge. She just gives rulings on cases brought before her. Again, this is not what most of the judges did, but Deborah definitely did. And while she was alive, that old city of Hazor made a comeback. And it ended up getting its revenge by oppressing two of the tribes, Zebulun and Naphtali. So she picks a general, a guy named Barak, to defeat their king. And just as she had said that God wanted to save them, Barak pulls it off. These tribes are again freed. Though the judge you're most likely to have heard of is a man named Samson. He came from the tribe of Dan, and his mother was told that if he didn't cut his hair or have grape products like wine, he'd be given super strength to fight the Philistines. One of the interesting things about Samson is his story is really similar to the story of Heracles or Hercules that you might have heard of beforehand. He does things like he kills a lion with his bare hands. Now, Samson goes on to marry a Philistine woman. Remember, the Philistines are the arch nemesis of the Israelites. But after marrying her, God would put him into these crazy rages where he'd kill tons of Philistines. At one point, he goes out and he burns down a bunch of Philistine crops. And in return, the Philistines burn up his wife and his father-in-law. So he goes out and he kills a bunch more Philistines. The Philistines demand that the Israelites turn him over or else. Samson, for his part, actually allows the Israelites to turn him over. He has them tie him up and hand him to the Philistines. But after he's given to the Philistines, he uses his super strength to break the ropes. And then he picks up the jawbone of an ass, of a donkey, to kill about 1,000 Philistines on his own. After this, he falls in love with a woman named Delilah. The Philistines actually end up bribing Delilah in order for her to give them the secret of his super strength. How can they stop this Superman of a dude? And she gets Samson to tell her about the power of him not cutting his hair. Since he didn't cut his hair, God had given him this great strength. And then she gets Samson to fall asleep and cuts his hair. This takes away his super strength. This allows him to get captured by the Philistines. After they take him, they gouge his eyes out. And then they make him perform in their temple in order to entertain them. But Samson asks God for one last bit of super strength. And luckily, during this time, some of his hair had grown back. And so God was able or willing to give him strength, since he again was getting some of that awesome super-powered hair back. With this strength that God gave him, he pulled down the pillars of the temple, killing himself and killing everybody in it. This is a real superhero story. This would fit in like modern-day Marvel movies. The book of Judges ends with a short bout of intertribal warfare. The tribe of Dan is attacked by the rest of the Israelites. And so it ends on a little bit of a downer and a little bit of a problem for the Israelites because they just can't be unified. In the next video, we're going to talk about how the Israelites, according to their story, were able to unify and become a kingdom, eventually two kingdoms. But that's for next time.